I'd like to introduce our next two presenters. We have our president, our founder of the International Council for Men and Boys, Dr. Ed Bartlett. He is going to co-present with a man who needs no introduction, the father of the Father's Rights Movement, Dr. Warren Farrell, and author of The Boy Crisis, and he is working on a part two of that book, The Men Crisis. But I'll give both of them the opportunity to share any additional information that they want. Please welcome Dr. Edward Bartlett and Dr. Warren Farrell.
Hey, great to be here. Good to see everybody, and thank you for our previous presenters who are truly inspiring. Thank you so much for coming here to Washington, D.C. and sharing your stories. Now, some of you may have noticed that I'm wearing rather odd clothing for a presenter. The t-shirt says gender equality for men, and I will explain the reason I'm wearing this in a few minutes, but I will say it does relate to the topic of the United Nations and talking about the global perspective. The global perspective clearly, increasingly, is influencing the policies and the public perceptions that we're talking about very much today. And so So the way we're going to do this is Warren Farrell is going to go first and talk about his upcoming book. Warren, are you with us?
I am. Can you hear me?
We certainly can. So Warren, I'm going to turn it over to you to share about your upcoming book and talk about why we need an international perspective on these issues, and then I'll pick up where you leave off. Welcome, Warren Farrell.
Thank you. The book I'm working on now is called The Man Crisis, and it's a follow-up of The Boy Crisis. And it's tied in also to the book I just finished, which is called Role Mate to Soul Mate. One of the reasons I've been, for the last 30 years, working on 7 different ways of getting men and women to overcome the barriers that they have to effective communication. And one of those barriers was the inability to handle personal criticism without becoming defensive. I found that to be almost a universal problem among all human beings. I realized that if I could get people to be able to handle personal criticism without becoming defensive, they would be less likely to divorce. And if they're less likely to divorce, there's less likely for the father to be left out of the equation. If there's less likelihood of the father being left out of the equation, there's less likelihood of having a boy crisis, because the boy crisis's single most important contributor is the lack of father involvement in the family. Almost a very high percentage of your suicides come from boys without dads. A great deal of the drug overdoses, the deaths of despair, the dropping out of high school, the failures to launch, the living in parents' basements after college or after high school, being unemployed. In the Boy Crisis book, I have an appendix which lists the 55 major connections between dad deprivation and the boy crisis. I don't call it fatherlessness because there's nobody without a father, but there are people who are dad deprived. That really is especially challenging for boys who grow up in mother-only homes, and then they go to elementary schools where there's mostly female teachers, and the boy has no solid male involved role model. These boys are much more vulnerable to being told that they can join a gang and have a family and have somebody that really cares for them. As they get older, they're much more likely to not do well financially and therefore be much more likely to be willing to do something like deal in drugs to get quick money. We have a whole series of problems like that. I promised Ed that I would go through some of the problems around the world that he has discussed, and then I would add some perspective on that in the areas of health and education and false allegations and shared parenting. In the education area, you had done a really good job looking at around the world problems with education. In your document on the UN has become beholden to feminist ideology. And one of the things I was adding when we were talking about that before was the OECD study that worldwide, in the 53 largest developed nations, boys fall behind girls in almost every academic subject. Two that they fall behind girls on are very important, reading and writing, because reading and writing are the two academic subjects that are the biggest predictors of success and failure in life. Notice I said academic subjects. The biggest predictor of success and failure in life is the lack of postponed gratification. And the lack of postponed gratification is one of the things that is problematic for boys who do not have dad-involved fathers. And number two is help.
So,
Go ahead.
Warren, let me suggest this, Warren. So why don't you go through my various slides and you jump in to share, just like you just did, on any of these issues that you would care to jump in on and share your additional perspectives. Can we do it that way?
That sounds perfect.
All right, excellent. Okay, so to tell you a bit about myself, I'm honored and delighted to be married to a wonderful woman from Peru, and I'd like to introduce my wife, Laura Leon, in the back seat. I'm not sure she's able to hear me or not, but I want to just give a shout out. I'll add that Laura is from Peru, and God has taken me to Peru 8 times over my life, and I do speak Spanish, so that informed my perspectives a little bit on the United Nations and how is the United Nations doing in addressing the issues of different parts of the world. So the United Nations goes all the way back to 1948. And one of the key founding documents of the United Nations is called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which you can see in front of you on the screen. And if you look at Article 2, it talks specifically about the importance of avoiding any distinction of factors such as race, color, sex, language, and others. So sex discrimination has been prohibited in the founding document of the United Nations, the Declaration of Human Rights. So things went along reasonably well until 2010. 2010 was the year that the UN Women was founded, and UN Women proclaims it has 2 objectives. Objective number 1 is to work for gender equality. Objective number 2 is to work for the empowerment of women. Okay? Now, as I'm going to explain in a minute, they do quite a good job on the empowerment side, but maybe not as good a job on the gender equality, and I'll explain why. So a lot of the focus right now in the United Nations, and by the way, I'll add that we've actually visited UN missions. We visited about 25 UN missions from about 25 countries. We've met with ambassadors, we've met with staffers. So we've gotten this information, part of it from the horse's mouth. So right now, a lot of the focus and a lot of the work of the United Nations is focused on what's called the SDGs, which stands for Sustainable Development Goals. And there are 24 SDGs, or Sustainable Developmental Goals. And number 5 is, no surprise, gender equality. And as you can see, look at their explanation. Achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. All right. So that gives you a perspective right there. And again, Warren, don't hesitate to jump in to share your thoughts as I go forward on this. So the question that we have to ask is, what about gender equality for men? That's the question that we need to ask. And that's the question we have asked in our 25 meetings with the UN missions. And as Larry DeMarco demonstrated in his initial presentation, there are some very real issues about gender equality for men. It's just not 1 or 2 things. It's across the board. So we now know that men and women are lagging in 12 areas. 3 years ago, we didn't really know that, but we started looking at the data, looking at the information from the World Bank, World Health Organization, and we realized there was a pattern here. It wasn't just 1 or 2 areas. And some people would go so far as to say, if there really are 12 areas of male disparity, whatever happened to the feared patriarchy, right? maybe it turns out there is no patriarchy, because if there was, they are doing a pretty poor job of helping men and boys dealing with these 12 areas of disparity. I realize I digressed a little bit with that comment, but I think it needs to be said. I'm going to go fairly briefly through the 12. Larry has already done an excellent job, and Warren has just talked about the education piece. Warren, anything you wanted to add to the education issue?
No, I think that's good, given the amount of time that we have. I'll stop where I stopped.
All right. The second is, and sorry I skipped the slide here, my background is in healthcare. I have a PhD in public health. This is the area that most interests me. Across the board, in most countries, there's a 5-year lifespan gender gap, and you can see the countries. In Russia, it's 11.6-year lifespan gender gap. Remember, it was 1991 when the Soviet Union fell apart. Guess what? We saw a dramatic increase in that lifespan gender gap beginning in 1991. These broader societal have an impact on men and their lives.
What I'll add there is that in 1920, there was a 1-year life expectancy gap between men and women. Today in the United States, it's 5.3 years. One of the main reasons is that there are fewer deaths in childbirth. We have to remember that 100 years ago, people lived today almost twice as long as they lived 100 years ago for all sorts of reasons. One of the reasons for the increase in the gender gap between men and women is that there are fewer deaths in childbirth. But another reason that we can really look at as men is, historically speaking, we've had social bribes to make men disposable. That is, we worship men as heroes if they were willing to be disposable in war. They got more money if they were willing to be disposable in the workplace, in the most hazardous jobs. We train boys for that, social bribes of disposability, in things like football in high schools. We use public money to support boys getting CTEs or beginning the process of developing CTEs from repeated hits on the head in football in high school. We have things like the option of flag football, which requires almost no hitting of each other on the head. We need to really examine the types of things that we do through public money and public education that lead to boys getting love and appreciation from cheerleaders who say first and 10, do it again, are encouraging boys to be loved by being disposable. That's one of the ways we can address the gap in male-female life expectancy.
Thank you. Now going on to point number 3 is what is often referred to as the boy crisis. And I'm going to turn this back to you, Warren, because you wrote the book literally on the boy crisis.
Yes, and let's see, what you have there is your focus on this issue. First of all, I think my next thing that we had talked about in our rehearsal for this was for me to comment on the false allegation issue. But the boy crisis is, I think if you were to look at the boy crisis book, and one of the things I have seen the best feedback on is the chapter 16, in which I talk about the 7 major differences between dad-style parenting and mom-style parenting, and how to create from that checks and balance parenting. So dads are far more likely to do things like roughhousing. They're more likely to tease. They're more likely to encourage a certain amount of risk-taking. But very few dads realize or are able to say to moms that one of the reasons I want to do roughhousing with the children is because the more roughhouse and create limitations to the roughhousing when the kids don't show consideration for their brothers and sisters with whom they're roughhousing, the more I do that, the more children are likely to become empathetic. Now, I've never heard a dad say, one of the reasons I want to roughhouse is because to increase the empathy of children, but that's the data there, that it does increase the empathy. It also increases something else called postponed gratification. So if a child knows that she or he is going to lose the roughhousing if they hurt their brother and sister, it not only makes them tune into their brothers and sisters' needs and feelings and fears, but it also they'd like to push their brother and sister out of the way to win at the roughhousing immediately. But in order to get the continuation of the roughhousing, they have to consider their brothers and sisters' needs. And so they have to therefore postpone the immediate gratification of pushing their brother and sister aside to win at the roughhousing. So those are just two examples of one of the 7 major areas of the differences between dad-style parenting and mom-style parenting. And I find that a lot of the people, the couples that I work with in my workshops, find that when they understand the value of what dads do, they really are much more likely to see the importance of fathers, not as a child wanting to roughhouse and have fun and be there for one more child to monitor, if you will, but rather a crucial player in the children's health and development, not only the boys, but also the girls.
Thank you. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over some of these. So I think you mentioned you'd like to say a little bit about the false allegations problem.
Yes, I think one of the things we can understand about false allegations is that China and Japan both have policies that if somebody makes a false allegation, that they receive not a slap on the wrist as they often do in the United States, but rather the same punishment as the person they're accusing of, who they're making an accusation about, would receive if that accusation were true. And they have found that has very much curtailed false allegations. We also have to look at the very minimal amount of due process that males are allowed in colleges and universities when they are accused of something. And so because of time, I'm not going to elaborate on that, but there's a fair amount in the Boy Crisis book on what to do to avert false allegations, especially in universities and especially among younger people.
Thank you. Now tell me again, I don't want to dwell on each one of these 12. So Warren, tell me which one you'd like to comment on as we go through this.
Your shared parenting would be the next one that I think I could make some contribution.
Okay. Let's see here. Did I skip it yet?
It should have been right shortly after.
There we are. Okay, yeah, and I'll just mention. So the bars that you can see on the right side of the screen shows the percentage of parents, divorced parents, that received equal shared parenting in 37 different countries. Now, but even in Sweden, I have to look very closely, but I believe it's 20%. Sweden, of course, is known as the gender equality capital of the world. If you go down to the United States, it's shown to be much lower. It's shown to be about 5%. So, Warren, what are your thoughts about that?
In the Boy Crisis, when I did the research for that, I looked at what I found were really what I call the 4 must-dos if there must be a divorce. The ideal, of course, is to learn great communication systems so you don't get a divorce, so you really hear each other. But if you do have a divorce, the 4 must-dos are equal shared parenting, and this is based on research finding these things to be of extreme value. That neither parent should the parents should have no more than 20 minutes drive time from one parent's home to the other. They also shouldn't live right next to each other for different reasons that I talk about in the Boy Crisis. Number 3, that there's no bad mouthing that the children can detect from mom to dad or dad to mom. And number 4 is that the parents participate in counseling at least once a month, not emergency-based counseling where people tend to argue for their perspective, but counseling where they have the opportunity to hear each other's perspective. And if those 4 things exist after divorce, the children are likely to do almost as well, not as well, but almost as well as they would in an intact family.
It is really impressive when you look at the research. All right, was there one other that you wanted to comment on, Warren, out of the remaining several?
The ones that we had talked about by making comments on are domestic violence, occupational death, and reproductive rights.
Okay, so let's go to domestic violence.
Yes, we often hear, many of us in this group are familiar with the work of Strauss, Gellis, and Steinmetz, who in the 1970s found that men and women battered each other about equally on 7 different levels of violence. And the good news is that many women, feminists especially, were totally opposed to that. The good news is that more than 200 people, mostly women and many of them feminists, have gone out to replicate to prove that wrong, and they have all found that that was about right. That men and women are likely to be violent about equally at all levels of violence. There's two major exceptions to that. More recently, high school girls and boys that are dating, the girls are about 8 times more likely to hit and slap the boys as the boys are to hit and slap girls. But the most fascinating finding is that while men are reported theoretically as being 50% more likely to kill a woman than vice versa, there was a complete lack of understanding of what was really happening there. Men and women kill differently. Men kill directly, and they leave, and they usually kill themselves after they kill their wives, whereas women are almost always will do contract killing. If they're wealthy, they'll hire a contract killer. If they're poor, they'll do a contract killing with a new boyfriend. And the common denominator is that the man always has a will. And the tricky part of it is that therefore the contract killing is designed to not discover that the killing was a direct killing, because a will is not given if the killing is done purposely. That's called murder. And so the contract killing is designed so that nobody finds out that that the man was killed on purpose, not by mistake. So it might be driven off of a road or something like that. But here's the big issue. If there is a contract killing, then the FBI does not, that's planned by a woman, then the FBI does not call it a woman killing the man. It lists it in a separate category called contract killing. So there's thousands more contract killings than there are murders of women by men. But we have no idea exactly what percentage of those contract killings are by women of men purposely. But the potential is for it to be much larger than the males killing the females and the other way around. So the explanation for that is given in much greater depth in the Women Can't Hear What Men Don't Say book.
Thank you. Let's go to homelessness now, which again, this is not just a problem in the United States for men. This is a global problem. We've looked at countries all around the world. This is a pattern that shamefully, in every country we've looked, the majority of the homeless are male. Warren, what are your thoughts on that?
That is accurate, and sometimes the data is a little confusing. It's the street homeless that are way disproportionately male. So in San Francisco, in the area where I live, 85% of the street homeless are males, and so they're in a much more precarious position than the sheltered homeless.
Okay, then finally, I think you mentioned reproductive and adoptive rights. What are your thoughts about this issue?
Yes, one of the things that I think is really important is for us to have what I call men's ABC rights. And that's that before there is an abortion, that men have to be consulted by the woman who's planning an abortion, that she's planning an abortion, and that the man has the option to sign a contract saying, I will take care of this child legally and financially completely, that your job, that you and I both contributed to this embryo, and so we both have responsibilities here. And one responsibility is just not being responsible, having an abortion. But the other compromise between that is offering the man the opportunity to legally and financially take care of that child. The woman has an obligation, which is to bring that child to term, and the man has the obligation for the next 18, 21 years of that child's life. And so that seems like a very, very reasonable trade-off to provide an option to abortion versus no abortion. The second is that in this group in particular, we need to work on making sure there is a men's birth control pill. Nothing changed women's and lives and the relationships between men and women more than the female birth control pill. There are many, many things that have been out for many years that have the potential for being used as a men's birth control pill. There's a number of reasons why it hasn't come out, but the reasons are not solid. And so being involved in the process of lobbying for men's birth control will give extremely great advantages to parity between men and women. And the third is that the father be able to be offered the opportunity to be involved in the child care at any point in that child's life, that the child should be equally involved with the father and the mother, and the father should have the right to that. So having a child without informing the father should be something that we as our group of men call for laws to be against children being able to be raised without the father being informed of the opportunity to equally raise that child. And so that's what I call men's ABC rights. The details for that in much greater depth are in the Women Can't Hear What Men Don't Say book.
Wonderful. So we're not going to do all 12, but this sort of gives you a flavor of this, both the scientific research and how it plays out in policies. Let's now turn to the United Nations and ask the question, what is the United Nations doing to address the 12 areas of male inequality? Because again, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is very clear. You can't discriminate on the basis of sex. And UN Women has said they believe strongly in gender equality. To answer this question, we did an in-depth analysis of the website of the United Nations to get a very comprehensive understanding. And this is what we found out. We looked in particular at the World Health Organization, the Human Rights Council, which is located in Geneva, Switzerland, and then we looked at some others as well. Let me tell you what we found out. To summarize in just a few words, the somewhat good, the bad, and the very ugly. That's what we found out. With the good, we found some definitely good things, and we want to give credit where credit is due. With the World Health Organization, the European Region Office did a strategy on the health and well-being of men in Europe, and it's a very good document. I've reviewed it. That's a commendable action. For International Men's Day, November 19th, the WHO has on several occasions, several years, done social media posts commemorating and highlighting International Men's Day. The tip of the hat for that. That's probably as far as we've found with the WHO. Now let's go to what we'll call the bad. Well, the UN has placed some attention on men's health and fatherhood, and there's been actually 3 documents that we found. The other 10 areas of male disparity have been flatly. With the very ugly, there is a widespread belief in the existence of the patriarchy. I've come to the conclusion there is no such thing as the patriarchy. The patriarchy does not exist in 2025, certainly in the United States or in the world. That said, I'll give you the examples in a minute. Second is the Human Rights Council, and the third is the new president of the General Assembly in New York City. Here goes. This is a person on the right, Antonio Guterres. He's from Portugal, and this past March they had what's called the Commission on the Status of Women met in New York City. We were actually there, and these are his exact words: "Women's rights are under siege." Adding that the quote, "the poison of patriarchy is back, and back with a vengeance." We'll just chuckle over that one. That was obviously from the highest level person in the United Nations.
Ed?
Yeah. Yes, Warren?
May I add something here?
Yes, we have 5 minutes left, so
Okay.
just to be aware, yes.
So when you hear friends use the word patriarchy, I find it's helpful to say to them that the world was not controlled historically by a patriarchy. It was controlled by the need to survive was the dominating force. And in order to survive, neither of our parents and grandparents had rights. They had responsibilities and obligations. They didn't even think of a world of rights when they were talking about surviving together. And so that's what controlled the world. And that gives people an understanding of, oh yeah, my grandparents, they could barely survive. And that helps them have an alternative vision of what controlled people prior to the last 50, 60 years.
Right. Okay. So let's now turn to one of the agencies. The United Nations has about 20 different agencies dealing with everything from International Labor Organization, World Health Organization, and others. So the Human Rights Council, unfortunately, is one of the most egregious violators of the human rights of men. And in particular, there's a person who works there. Her name is Reem Asalam, and she has a title. It's called Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls. Well, that title right there gives you a hint right there of the bias. So in 2023, she wrote about a 50-page document about titled Custody, Violence Against Women, and Violence Against Children, claiming that parental alienation is a, quote, unscientific pseudo-concept. All right? And I'm just going to mention one of the persons in this room today, Bill Burnett, wrote a response to this extremely biased and unscientific document that shows that it is based, parental alienation is based on science. It is not a pseudo concept. Well, she wasn't done. 2025, earlier this year, sex-based violence against women and girls makes very one-sided claims, again, only recognizing violence against women and girls, never, not once, recognizing the fact that men and boys also are victims of domestic violence on an equal basis. So that's the Human Rights Council. And then last, I'll mention the new president of the General Assembly. The General Assembly is that body that meets in New York City. They meet beginning in September for 1 or 2 months every year. And she was just elected as the new president, and her election was hailed as, at long last, we have a female who is the president of the General Assembly, as if this will be a milestone in the history of the General Assembly. And she is also, she's from Germany, and she previously developed what's called feminist foreign policy. You can imagine what that's all about. So in response, our partner organization, DAVIA, Domestic Abuse and Violence International Alliance, has encouraged DAVIA member organizations to contact their UN ambassadors, has held these meetings with the 25 missions, and has done a number of press releases. Some of them, I will add, are strongly worded, as they should be, given the gravity of the human rights violations that we are seeing from the Human Rights Council. Last, I'll end on an encouraging note, and this was just a couple months ago. A woman named Layini, who is from Uganda, issued a press release saying, hey, if we're going to have a UN Women Agency, isn't it only fair and logical that we have a UN Men Agency? So she actually did this press release. You can see her picture there. So that concludes the presentation. You can see there's a lot going on. We cannot ignore the United Nations. We must pay attention to what they're doing, because it is having an impact on the United States and globally.